Welcome to the Landbridge podcast. I'm Lucinda Horrocks. This episode looks at fascinating research which applies computer modelling to map the likeliest routes used by First Peoples as they walked across early Australia, starting from perhaps as early as 75,000 years ago. As we will see, this helps us understand how people traversed the Bassian Plain, which became a land bridge linking southeastern Australia to the island of Lutruwita, Tasmania, it is thought, approximately 43,000 years ago. This is a conversation with Dr. Stefani Crabtree, an Associate Professor of Social Environmental Modelling at Utah State University and scientist at the Santa Fe Institute, and Distinguished Professor Sean Ulm, Director of the Australian Research Council Centre for Excellence for Indigenous and Environmental Histories and Futures at James Cook University. The interview was conducted in 2023 by remote telephone hookup. Each of us were in different locations. Sean was in Queensland, I was in Victoria, and Stefani was in the United States. So apologies for any patchy audio quality you might hear in this interview. Stefani and Sean, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much, Lucinda.
Great to be here.
So, what prompted you to research the potential ways people could have crossed these very old landscapes in Australia's deep past?
I think that the answer to this question is in a couple of parts. The first answer that I would give is because I think that modern peoples tend to think of peoples in the ancient past as maybe having not had as deep of connections as we do now. We're connected via things like mobile phones and Facebook, and so it's kind of difficult for us to imagine how people lived 70,000 years ago. But people who lived 70,000 years ago lived very similarly to how we do today. They formed families. They were interested in exploring. They were interested in their environments around them. They cared about their children and their grandchildren. And they migrated like we do today. And so one of the reasons that I was drawn to this question was really to see the similarities of people from deep time until now. These people who lived that long ago are really, really not very different from us today. And so I wanted to apply computational modeling to try and understand some of the decisions that people would have made in the past to populate a continent. Why working in Australia? It's a very interesting place because there weren't other hominins, human-like people in the continent when early people arrived. And so people were the first people to arrive and to walk around the continent. And so it's an interesting place that is very large, that Homo sapiens were the first people to arrive there. And so we can ask and answer some very interesting questions using fundamentals of decisions that people today would have made going into a novel landscape. And so I think that these two questions together, the thrill of working in a novel landscape, wanting to really understand the things that have made people for so long, really brought me to be working on this question with Sean and with the rest of the modeling team. And I am a computer modeler and an archaeologist, and I'm always looking at ways to use computational tools to really refine the things we understand about the past and about present people as well.
Mm. And why is the time period of which you write about between 70,000 years ago and 20,000 years ago significant?
Can I just to add to what Stephanie said about the framing of the question, we've spent a lot of energy, and our research group has spent a lot of time thinking about how people moved through Wallacea. That's the group of islands between the continent of Australia and Southeast Asia, to work out how people traversed those seaways to get to Australia. But a lot less energy has been devoted to working out what people did once they arrived in Australia. And over the last 50 years or so, our understanding of the antiquity of Indigenous occupation in Australia has dramatically increased. When I was an undergraduate student 30 or so years ago, we were talking about 40,000 years ago, and then very quickly it was 50,000 years ago, and we certainly have archaeological sites that are 65,000 years ago in northern Australia. But our modelling suggests that the date of peopling of the continent is even earlier than that, and it's settling around 75,000 years ago. So one of the important things of a research project like this is filling in the gaps, because we don't have physical evidence surviving from such a deep time period in the past. So we need to use different methods to try and understand the lifeways of people. And this is a really important cutting edge use of technology to explore what's happening there.
I'm going to add on to that too. I'm sorry. We're just going to do
You're
this. um, so once these earlier models really understood where people arrived, that's where that question of where people walked to when they got to Sahul, that supercontinent that includes Australia, New Guinea, Tasmania. And so, using this modeling technique, using things that we understand about people's decisions for where they walk, this is how we then could look at where people would have gone throughout the entire continent once they arrived. So, we have those early dates of people's arrival. Well, what happens then between that time and when we start seeing more archaeological sites later on? And so, all of these things come together to let us ask and answer some very interesting questions about people in the past.
So fascinating. So it's a long time ago and the landscape has actually changed. Can you talk us through how different the landscape was then compared to today? You mentioned the supercontinent Sahul. Yeah, what was the landscape like?
Well, one of the things we really need to think about is that for most of the human history of the continent, it looked nothing like it does today. For most of the human history of Australia, mainland Australia was connected to both Tasmania in the south and New Guinea in the north, and the land area was up to 30% bigger than it is today. So a lot of that land area were the continental shelves around the continent, which accounts for about 2 million square kilometres of land. And again, for most of the human history of the continent, sea levels were lower, and those continental shelves around the margin of the continent were exposed as dry land. And those, that they were huge quantities of land with rivers flowing across them and mountains and swamps and lakes. And people were born and lived their lives and died on lands that are now under the sea. And indeed, many First Nations communities around Australia have oral histories of using and living those now submerged lands, and indeed really strong oral histories of rising sea levels and transformation of their sea country. So this period between 70,000 years ago and 20,000 years ago is critically important for understanding how people move through the continent and how they live their lives. So 20,000 years ago is the height of the last ice age. So 20,000 years ago was the coldest, driest period, and huge volumes of seawater were frozen in the North and the South Poles, but also in glaciers across North America and Canada and Northern Europe. And that frozen seawater reduced sea levels in the Australian region by up to 130 metres. And those reduced sea levels exposed the continental shelves and connected Australia to New Guinea and Tasmania. So the other part of this, which is still being debated by researchers, is what the climate was like during this very long period. And of course, that huge period between 70,000 years ago and 20,000 years ago wasn't just one period of time. There was as much climate variability as there is today. But from 70,000 years ago to 20,000 years ago, the overall trend was getting drier and colder. So rainfall was less than it is today. And in many parts of Australia, temperatures were 6 to 8 degrees colder than they are today. However, it was variable across the continent, and it's now clear that there are some areas that had permanent fresh water and, may have been more attractive places to live then than they are now. And some of those big freshwater lakes are actually on the now submerged continental shelves, including Bass Strait.
Wow. Stephanie, I see you making some notes. Did you want to add something to that answer?
I am making notes for my next answer so that I don't get the number of pathways wrong.
Well, let's move on to the next question, which is about how this computer model worked.
Yeah, so within a computer model, you have to make all kinds of decisions to make the model have the most explanation possible, but without having too much. It's something we call parsimony. So to make a parsimonious model, you have exactly as many things as you would need to describe the system without too many. I have a friend who describes parsimony as a parsimony backpack. So when you're backpacking, you have to bring a tiny little mattress. Yes, your queen size mattress at home would be much more comfortable, but it would be too hard to carry. So within this model, we made a lot of decisions about parsimony. So we started by creating a new digital elevation model for all of Sahul. So what this is it's a map that is now connecting Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania, and those drowned coastlines as well, including Bass Strait. So we created this new model, this geographic model, that could be the base. From that, we then start modeling the individual people. So we decided to assume that women would keep the group together when people would be walking across the landscape. So we could model men, we could model women, we could model children, but we wanted to have an average individual. So we decided this would be a 25-year-old woman because she would be helping to carry the children. She would be helping to make sure that people are being provisioned, that she would on average be carrying about 10 kilos of things with her, whether that's carrying water, maybe she has to carry her child for a bit of time. And that she was a certain number of, do you use feet or meters?
Centimeters.
Sorry. Use centimeters. So like 160 centimeters. I'm going to back up a second. Sorry, I was about to say 5 feet. And then, like I said, I was going to have some times when I just like completely bollocks things up. It's 160 centimeters short, Sean. How tall are you?
That's 5 feet.
173.
Okay, so 160 is reasonable, like not tiny, but okay.
That's about 5
Pretty
feet.
small.
Yeah, it's
Okay,
short.
I was correct.
Yes.
I was correct. Okay, sorry, that was great.
It was a great answer too. You were doing really well.
So then we want to model the individual people. And so we decided to model women as the individuals who will be keeping the rest of the people together. So we can model children, we can model adults, whether they're women or men. They'll each have different requirements. So we decided to model women because women would be keeping the packs of people together. We decided that women would be around 25 years old, about 160 centimeters tall, and that they'd be carrying on average around 10 kilos, whether they're carrying water, they might be carrying a child for some of that amount of time. But all of this is important for when we put people on the landscape because they will have different metabolic needs as they're walking. So it turns out that the United States Army has done all kinds of research into the metabolic needs for people walking all over the place. And so we start with these coupled differential equations. So essentially these big math models that tell us what happens when a person walks up a hill, walks down a hill, walks across a flat landscape, because all of these things put stress on your body. When you're walking downhill, it stresses your knees. When you're walking uphill, it's harder, especially if you're carrying your toddler. And so we have all of these things calculated for every single pixel on the landscape. So when our 25-year-old woman carrying 10 kilos and 160 centimeters tall starts walking, we can calculate the stresses that would be on her body as she walks across the landscape, whether she's going uphill, downhill, or across some sandy bits or whatever. From the landscape, we also calculate what's known as a view shed. So a view shed is when you're standing in a place, what do you see? So from my house, I can actually see some mountains. And so my view shed would say that these mountains are very tall and the valley over to my west is actually quite low. So we did this for every pixel in the landscape as well. So we have the new geography for all of Sahul. We have this view shed for all of Sahul. We have the average age and height of a woman walking through Sahul who's carrying things. And as she walks around, there are different calculations for every single pixel. And so from this base, we can then start running our models. So for our models, we modeled quite a lot of different things. So we had a naive model. What happens if all of these people just show up at the embarkation points when people arrive from Wallachia and they just walk? They just walk throughout Sahul. There's no real destination. Maybe they start in one place and maybe we tell them to end in another. So what do those pathways look like? What happens if, as people are walking, they also want to take into account whether or not they can find fresh water? So we mapped the hydrology of this area as well. What happens if, as people are wayfinding, they do what modern people do, which is you look to high points on the landscape and you kind of guide yourself against those things. So we used all of these to run the model many, many different times to get these many different outputs and to start with the simplest, the most parsimonious. And then we add in those things like needs for fresh water, using high points to help with your wayfinding to be able to get to the end. I should note that those calculations from the US Army, if you've ever opened a guidebook for hiking and you see it says that the trail is easy, moderate, or difficult, that's actually the same kind of thing. It's just that this is a more complicated way of saying it's easy, moderate, or difficult. We're calculating the exact caloric expense on an individual in that same way.
And how many times did you run the model? I know you've got different levels of complexity, but it was many, wasn't it?
Well, all told, all in, for every single one of these, from the most naive model to the most explanatory model, we generated 125 billion pathways. So that's a lot.
And what did the results tell you?
Well, after generating 125 billion pathways, we then had to figure out, well, what to do with them. And this is the interesting thing. So Sean and I are both trained as archaeologists, but only once we ran the model did archaeology actually come into account with this. Until then, we're using the basic metabolic needs of people and the underlying geography of the continent. So we compiled a database of the oldest archaeological sites in Sahul. And we then looked at the locations of those sites and we compared them to where the different pathways were. And we compared them to when people were not wayfinding from heights and from high places, or people were not using fresh water. And it turns out that those simulations, when people were wayfinding using high points to help them move across the landscape and were looking for fresh water, that the model people walked more closely to where those archaeological sites are. So we use this as a data set after the fact to check the model. And so what the model ended up telling us is that people, when they got to Sahul, used similar properties that we would use today if we were to come into a landscape we'd never been to before. They wayfinded by looking to the high points that helped orient themselves on the landscape. They walked near fresh water, and that's where the archaeological sites were found.
It's fascinating.
I'm happy to add a little bit to that, Lucinda. That was a fantastic explanation, Stephanie. I guess there's a couple of things here, and one of them is understanding that the very first people who came to the supercontinent of Sahul were not only anatomically modern, but they were cognitively modern. So the very first people to step onto the continent were indistinguishable from you or I. And what that also means is that they had all of the planning, imaginative capacity that you and I have. And people were able to encounter new environments and new problems and solve them, much in the way that we do today. And what the outputs of the model show us is that there are persistent principles that underlie decision-making processes in all landscapes, for all humans, modern humans. And the model outputs show us that certain routes were almost certainly preferred over other routes, and they really form the backbone of the analysis. I mean, how do we know they're real? Well, in one sense, we don't. But in another sense, we know from our work with First Nations communities that many of those high probability superhighways are well-known trade and exchange routes, and also important routes for storylines and the movement of ancestors across the landscape. So we know that many of them are very persistent places on the landscape and important culturally. The other thing we also know is that many of those high probability routes map onto stock routes, and even modern road systems, which were built and used for much the same reasons as people traverse them today. But also many of those roads and stock routes were used based on the information that Indigenous traditional owners gave to Europeans about moving through their countries. So these things we're finding are not only tell us about the very distant past, but also the more recent past. And in fact, many of the roads that many of the people listening to this are used today are almost certainly part of ancestral pathways that have been used for millennia.
You're right. If you look at the map, you can see the superhighways, as you call them, from this deep past do map very closely with the modern day road networks. I noticed that too.
I would like to explain one more thing about the model that I missed, and that is how these routes are created. Sorry, you're going to have to do some splicing. So the way that we are able to track the routes that people take throughout Sahul is every single pixel in the landscape. We call this approach from everywhere to everywhere because it actually allows individuals to move through every single pixel, unlike traditional, what are known as least cost paths, which look at just what is the least calorically costly. We know that people move through landscapes for a number of different reasons. So the way that we create these routes essentially is as people start on the landscape, when they move through a pixel, that pixel counts that a person went there. So just like when you're going to the fair and there's someone standing near the front with the little ticker that goes click, click, click every time a person comes in, we essentially have a digital one of those on every single pixel. So as people move through, we know how many people are going through this particular pixel. Every single pixel in the landscape in the model has been chosen at least once. So people have moved through it at least one time. But what we do know is people preferentially choose certain pathways. And so then once we get essentially the spaghetti map out, we can look at the highest probability chosen pathways. We can look at the highest 50% or the highest 10% or 5% or 1%. When we start looking at those that are chosen the most frequently, that's what we end up calling the superhighways, because they're what people are choosing to move across the most amount of times. So then when we have those networks that look quite a bit like the modern road networks, that's when we compare them to the archaeological data. So that is why we call them superhighways. There are pathways throughout all of Sahul, but these most frequently chosen ones are these ones that we see as being particularly persistent from 70,000 years ago or so until today.
So fascinating. And Sean alluded to this, but it's worth asking again. It's a model, so it's it's all hypothetical, but how confident are you that it's a reliable guide to what actually did happen 70,000 to 20,000 years ago?
I am very confident that it's a reliable guide to what happened between 70,000 and 20,000 years ago because it is built on principles of geography and of human decision making. And as Sean and I have said, these people who arrived are pretty indistinguishable from you and me. They have the same kind of memory ability, they have the same kind of decision making, they have the same kind of family needs and wants, they have the same kind of ecological needs and wants that we do too. And so people are making decisions for movement across this landscape in a very similar way to how people would today. As long as our models of the geography are very sound, which they are, and as long as our models of human cognition are very sound, which they are, and as long as our models of how people move across landscapes are pretty sound, which you'll have to ask the US Army, but I think they're pretty sound. I think that all of this is led together to say that this is a very likely scenario of how people would have moved. And then we see the archaeology there near these superhighways, and that really tells me that we can build models that are based on parsimonious understanding of people and geography in the past to have inferences about the places that people would have moved to as they're doing something as exciting as exploring a new continent.
Fabulous. Well, moving on to the Bass Strait land bridge, because as you know, this story that you've written this article for is about the land bridge which once connected mainland Australia and Tasmania in the time period that you're talking about. So first of all, what is a land bridge? And then what did your modelling tell you about this particular region?
So a land bridge is a piece of land that's exposed at times of lower sea level. And in the case of mainland Australia and Tasmania, we call that once exposed land the Bassian Plain. But I think the word plain kind of undervalues how diverse that landscape was. So, it's about 250 kilometres wide, about 500 kilometres long. So we're talking over 100,000 square kilometres of land that once was above sea level, that people lived on and may have lived their whole lives on that plain that is now underwater. So from about 70,000 years ago to about maybe 15, 12,000 years ago, it was possible to walk across that land bridge from Tasmania to what is now Victoria. And the entire land bridge was entirely exposed up until about 15,000 years ago. So it's quite a dramatic landscape, a big piece of land. Now, what's really interesting from an archaeological perspective is we know that the ancestors of Palawa people have been in Tasmania for many, many millennia. And the oldest cultural places that we know about are in the southwest of Tasmania, dated to around 40,000 years ago. But our modelling suggests that the ancestors of Palawa people arrived in Tasmania much, much earlier. And if we're talking about an entry into the continent of Sahul 75,000 years ago, our modelling suggests that people would have reached Tasmania within 10,000 years. So that means that it's much more likely that Aboriginal people were in Tasmania by 60, 65,000 years ago. We just don't have the archaeological evidence for that. So what that means is that for most of the peopled history of Tasmania, it was connected to the rest of Australia. In fact, the isolation of Tasmania is only very, very recent in the last 12,000 years. So when we are thinking about the long-term history of Aboriginal people in Tasmania, it's really a connected history with the rest of Australia. So one of the really significant paleogeographic features of that now submerged land bridge is a massive freshwater lake on the central western part of that land bridge. which is up to 125 meters deep and would have been an isolated freshwater lake up until about 20,000 years ago or shortly afterwards. So a massive freshwater body that would have had lots of resources that would have been an attractive place for people to move around and live by. Uh, After 20,000 years ago, the global climate started to warm up and those ice caps started to melt and global sea levels started to rise. And by about 15,000 years ago, the sea began to encroach into that freshwater lake and turned it into an estuarine system. And in general, sea level rise impacted Bass Strait from west to east. So for a long time, it was still possible to walk along the eastern side of Bass Strait between Tasmania and Victoria as the sea level started to rise and make that pathway narrower and narrower. And finally, that was cut off completely around 12,000 years ago. That's a very long answer, Lucinda. I was aiming for conciseness and it didn't work out that way.
I love it. I loved
You're
it.
a full professor. You're allowed to talk on and on.
Did the modelling show likely pathways along that Bass Plain as well?
I will answer that question, but I want to say something first, and then I'll come back to answering that question. I'm sure that by now people have figured out, based on my accent, that I'm American, and we are talking about things that happen within Australia. I think that it's very hard for people in young countries to think about things that are very time depth. So Australia, I believe, was colonized in 1788 by the British. So your country has about 260 years of history if we're thinking about modern colonial history. America is about the same, right? Our revolution happened around that same time. So 260 years, and thinking about what happened 260 years ago and how places have changed in that amount of time can impact how we think about our country. But Bass Strait existed as a place that people could live for 55,000 years. And that, I think, is something that is hard for a lot of people to conceptualize, is that a lot of Western history is very short. And here we're talking about something that was very long, that people would have spent their whole lives, as Sean stated, in this area, that their grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents would have been there, that there would have been histories and stories about that land, that that freshwater lake would have been critical for things like drinking water, cooling off in the summer, or hunting other animals, and that this existed for 55,000 years, which is longer than the history of, if we want to talk about our governments in our current countries. And so trying to conceptualize that time depth, I think, is very hard, but I think it's a good thing to think about, because our world has these stories that are very deep in time, and these stories from a long time ago can have a lot of relevance for things that are happening today. Now I will answer your other question, which was, were there paths that went through Bass Strait? Is that correct? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so within our model, where we were looking at the whole continent of Sahul, we did see, of course, as I've said before, there were paths through every single pixel on the landscape. There were people within our model that climbed to the top of mountains, for example, for one reason or another. But there was at least one superhighway that connected what would be mainland Australia to Tasmania through Bass Strait. And it skirted the edge of this freshwater lake, which was probably very important for people to get fresh water, to go hunting, to camp on the side of, to cool off. Probably very important, both spiritually and just economically, frankly. And so there was this one very large, very important pathway that connected these areas. And what we would suggest from our model is that this pathway was very frequently chosen because of various features, that people would have handed down knowledge about these pathways, these roads, these routes that people could have taken across the area to connect that very southern tip to the rest of the continent as well.
Mm.
Look, just following up on that, I think this our outcome where that superhighway is mapped onto the landscape, onto the land bridge, reflects the power of the model that it's including paleogeography. And we use the best bathymetric data we could to try and understand the topography of the landscape, including where those paleolake features were. And of course, that eastern side of Lake Bass, on the eastern side of Bass Strait, is one of the shallowest parts of Bass Strait today, about 60 metres, 56 to 60 metres below the current sea level. So that was the most persistent route. I think there's a big, question here about what happened when sea level rose. What happened to people as sea levels started rising and encroaching onto the Bassian Plain and reducing the land country that people had? And we think that people had no choice. And certainly around Australia, there's Indigenous oral histories documenting that people evacuated their country as sea level rose. And in some parts of Australia, sea level rose at sometimes very, very rapidly, that each high tide could move the coastline in some low-lying areas. So we know over those thousands of years that sea level was rising, that people were evacuating their country. And in a place like Bass Strait, we think that people moved both north and south. So north onto mainland Australia, what is now southern Victorian coastline, and south onto what is now the northern coastline of Tasmania. And the archaeological evidence seems to support that argument that around 10, 9, 8,000 years ago, as sea levels are approaching their modern levels, we see a lot more archaeological sites along the southern coast of Victoria and the northern coast of Tasmania. And we think that might be reflecting the higher density of people in those landscapes. Now, uh, we think that people would have moved, migrated from their country along kinship lines, that people like they are today are related by family groups to others. So they're not kind of moving, displacing another group. They're using their alliance systems and kinship networks to accommodate that. But the overall result may have been higher population densities, which may have actually triggered a whole range of other activities because it would have required adaptation to a different environment. This time, not necessarily a different climate or landscape, but a different peopled landscape. And that would have required further adjustments for people to, for example, have enough food to support an expanded population. So those rising sea levels and the evacuation of the continental shelves may have been related to a whole lot of other technological and cultural changes that echo down the millennia. And there's simply another example of First Nations people adapting to dramatically changing environments.
Hmm. And of course, it has resonance with us today because we are grappling with exactly the same issues of changing landscapes and coastlines in response to rising sea levels.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things, as Stephanie was pointing out about our shallow history, that we haven't experienced the full range of climate and environmental variability in documented European histories. And in fact, First Nations people and their cultural record have a much, much deeper time depth that in general we've failed to incorporate into modern planning that could make our management regimes and future planning a lot more robust.
I agree with that statement completely. And I think that some of the things that people experienced as they moved from this area that connected, from the Bass Strait area that connected Tasmania and mainland Australia, and as they consolidated into these areas, people would have, of course, followed along kinship lines, but they also would have had to make choices about people who they knew who were going farther away. And so I think that there are lessons there for us too, as we're looking at these kinds of challenges we're dealing with now, that migrations of people, whether they are forced or whether they are voluntary, are going to have repercussions. And they'll have both positive repercussions in the consolidating of kinship networks and new technologies. But there will also be difficult decisions and difficult repercussions as well. And I think that this kind of work can shed some light on how some of these decisions were made.
It's so interesting. So, final thoughts, wrapping up. What would you like our audience, to the listeners, to take out of this story of human connections to that ancient or deep past landscape of the Bass Strait?
Look, I think fundamentally this type of research that we're doing shows us how little we know and how much more there is to know. And I think working in partnership with traditional owner and custodian communities on country, which is happening everywhere as we speak, is revealing much more nuanced accounts of the deep past than we've had available to us today. And along with traditional archaeological techniques and anthropological techniques, geomorphological techniques, Indigenous knowledge systems and histories being incorporated into those stories, having integrity in their own right, and putting those two sources of data together to tell a more complete story is really in its infancy. And I think the whole entire history of our continent is going to be rewritten in the next decade. And I'm really excited to see when we have this conversation in 10 years' time, what's changed. And I suspect it'll be a dramatically different understanding of the continent we live in.
I think models, it's late, sorry. I think models are a very interesting thing because they enable you to check your assumptions that you have about your understanding of a place. And models should always surprise you in some way or another. If it tells you exactly everything you knew, you probably did it a little bit wrong. The thing that I find really interesting about these models is the ways that the results that we had really did, I think, reflect and reify a lot of the deep stories from traditional owners throughout this region. And I think that these models are also interesting and surprising in that they tell us there's so much we don't know about the past, about where archaeology is. And I think for Bass Strait in particular, one of the things that this highlights is how amazing it would be to really be able to see everything that's going on under the water and to really be able to see these pathways that people migrated across and see these decisions that people made. I think that these models tell us that history was constantly unfolding, that there was an interaction between people and the landscape for 70,000 years, and that the things that we see today are reflections of how things are today, but also reflections of how the past built upon itself and the decisions that ancestors made hundreds of generations ago. This deep history is exciting and beautiful and interesting and can really help us to understand a lot more about people, about our planet, and about these ecosystems that are underwater for the moment, but they might not always be. Or we might be able to explore them in a different way and be able to bring these stories about. So models help us to tell stories in a different way and to help us refine our understanding. And I think that this work really helped me to refine my understanding of the ways that people create these networks across a big space and the ways that people have always been people and how we can learn from our past.
What a way to wrap up. History constantly unfolding. People have always been people. And I do look forward to this conversation in 10 years' time. I'm going to hold you to that because I want to find out what the research says. Sean and Stefani, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Next episode is a very special conversation with Bunurong women Auntie Gail Dawson and Tasma Walton about saltwater women's dreaming stories and connections to long past deep time coastal places. A range of companion media, a documentary film and other stories are freely available to read, listen to, watch and share on the website thelandbridge.au. The Landbridge digital story was produced by Wind and Sky Productions. Creative producers were me, Lucinda Horrocks, and Jarry Nemo. The credits for this episode are detailed in the podcast program notes. The project was funded by the Australian Government through the Our Marine Parks Grants Program. Until then, thanks for listening.